Nashville, Tennessee at the Ryman Auditorium. I'm just kidding. It's just me. I'm in my basement in Silver Spring, but I am glad to be here and I'm really glad that you're here. Welcome to day 3 of our Certified Information Security Manager certification, the CISM certification, as you know, and we've been covering some good information up until this point, and we'll continue from this point forward. So, day 1, we talked about information security governance and really looking to senior leadership to direct us within our organization to set the vision, the direction, the strategy that we need to go as an organization so that we can take that and apply that to our information security program, which we're going to focus in on today. Now, yesterday we looked at risk management and we decided and really kind of emphasized that cybersecurity is risk management. We look at what we're protecting, we look at what it's worth. Then we figure out what threats and vulnerabilities exist. We try to get a value for the risk. Then we look at the value of the risk versus the cost of the countermeasure, and we make a good decision with a return on investment that's positive, a better benefit to cost ratio than perhaps other solutions. And then we implement those solutions and we continue to monitor. So that's where we've come so far. And I did have a question or two in the chat. Actually, it looks like a single question on GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. So I had that taken off the slides because they're no longer testing on that idea. Not that it's not important, but they don't per se, talk about where would this fall under GRC. But I'm glad you brought it up because the whole purpose of GRC comes to us from some of the problems we had back in the 90s. If you remember, there was a lot of corporate shenanigans going on. There were senior executives misappropriating funds. People's retirement plans were pretty much wiped out. There was a whole lot of there was a lack of accountability for the governing entities within an organization. So the Open Ethics and Compliance Group said, basically came out and published some principles and standards of behavior to address governing bodies within an organization, to provide a framework for risk management, and to provide guidance for maintaining compliance with laws and regulations. And that became affectionately known as GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. So, those are 3 areas of concern that senior leadership is, of course, focused on. The governance principles provide, just those sound guidelines and the goals of what we should expect from our senior leaders. And then, of course, risk management integrated throughout the organization. And one of the goals being compliance, laws, regulations, perhaps industry standards, and compliance at the very least with policy and procedures internally. So that's GRC. I don't think that there's anything specific you need to know about it. It certainly doesn't hurt to have addressed it, and I'm glad you brought it up. I think that's a great question. Every now and then I'll blow through something on a slide. So if I do that, just let me know or just feel free to ask, just like our guest did. Hey, did we need to know that? It's a quick answer for me, and I'm happy to do it. All right. So fabulous way to start off the day is have a question from yesterday. That's a nice lead in to what we're doing today, kind of a way of wrapping that up. And I do want to remind you as we move along, if you have questions, and a couple of you have asked questions along the way, and hopefully you can attest to the fact that I don't bite. I'm happy to answer those questions. So if you have questions today, tomorrow, feel free to ask them. All right. But without further ado, then now it's time to focus on domain 3. And domain 3 is our information security program. And our information security program, well, I'll tell you what ISACA says it is in just a minute. But what we're going to focus here is on developing the program and maintaining it, managing it on an ongoing basis. So let's see what ISACA says about our information security program. We're going to start off this chapter by answering that questions and looking at some general concepts. Then we're going to talk about the elements of a security policy. One of the things that we have to do in order to get a security policy or security program or policy approved is we need, I just misspoke. One of the things we need to do to get an information security program approved, in order to develop it, we have to convince senior leadership we need one, or more likely a new one. So we have to provide a business case, justification that says this is what we're doing and why. One of the first elements of our security program, and I've talked about this on both days leading up, we have to have a way to identify our assets, to provide guidance for owners as they determine the value in the category of assets. And then we have to have a means of saying, okay, based on the value that's been chosen for this asset, here are the security controls. And that falls under the category of identifying assets and classifying. Now, when we do talk about security controls, we'll talk about management, operational, and technical controls, three different categories of controls. And then we'll just wrap up with just a little note on cloud integration, as there have been some very generic cloud questions come onto the exam. So, what's a security program? Well, the easy answer is this is how we accomplish our strategy. Yesterday I used the example of football, how, when you interview a coach and say, "What's your strategy?" They give you very broad information, not really actionable. Maybe it's actionable, but it doesn't give me enough details to act upon them well. So a football coach may say, "Okay, we're going to run the ball more. We're going to try to open up the passing lanes. We're going to be aggressive on defense." I mean, you hear that over and over when you hear coaches, "Hey, what are you going to do this game?" They almost always say the same thing. Okay. But behind those broad strokes, there's a coach sitting in the locker room drawing out X and O's and patterns for running and who's blocking who. That's what our security program does. It provides the detail to strategy. It's where the rubber meets the road. We have these lofty ideas of, oh, we're going to improve customer performance. That's great, but how? That's your information security program. So if we take it from ISACA, which I recommend that we do, since they're the folks that put out the CISM exam, what's this program all about? We're going to figure out how to develop and maintain. Okay, so how we begin and how we manage after, implementation. A program that, this is big, it identifies, manages, and protects organizational assets. That's what it comes down to when we talk about securing an organization. We got to figure out what's important, got to manage it, protect it, while aligning to security strategy and business goals. Always, always, always going back to the goals of the business. And I'm not kidding you. If they are going to find some way to make sure you understand that all the way throughout the exam, that we start with the goals of the business. You've just been hired to revamp an organizational security policy. What's the first thing you should do? Well, I should meet with senior leadership, understand the organization and the goals and objectives of the business. Long before I start collecting information on assets or start designing security controls, we meet with leadership. We determine the goals and objectives of the business. And if you remember from risk management yesterday, we talked about context. We talked about framing in relation to risks and understanding our environment. So we're understanding strategy and business goals, thereby giving us an effective security posture and exposure to risks that is acceptable within the guidelines provided by senior leadership, right? Now, this next point, it's best coordinated by the chief operating officer. I would rather that word say it's best sponsored. So, but I can live with coordinated. And the idea is, what is security all about? The business. So if it's a security professional designing and having the final say on a security program, I know that I, along with other security professionals, are going to err on the side of security. Lock it down, lock it down, lock it down. And we talked about yesterday, particularly, you can have too much security. You ask me to secure the organization, I'll just have everybody unplug their computers. Boom. Much more secure than you were the day before, right? But the problem with that is now we can't do anything as a company. So we have to have operations, and remember, the operations team, they're really the owners of the data. They have to be the one that determines the right amount of data. And I'm sorry, the right amount of security. And that's going to be the basis for our security program. So I'm not saying there aren't other leaders consulted or involved, but when it comes right down to it, if you have to have a senior officer say, here's my name on the line, the chief operating officer is going to be the best. Now, in reality, we'd really love a steering committee overseeing the development of the information security program and them signing off. So that would be best case. But I put this because I've seen a question on test prep that basically said, okay, you need somebody to sponsor the security program. Do you want the chief executive officer? You want the chief security officer, the chief risk officer, or the chief operating officer? Well, remember, the security officers typically dealing with non-IT threats. The risk officers typically dealing with risks that are non-IT. The chief operating officer has a lot on their plate, but they're focused with operations being efficient and effective. So that's kind of a little ding test question type. It's not anything that you'll see on the exam per se, but just that idea. Okay, so what should this thing that we're calling the security program, what should it do? What should it give us? Strategic alignment. I know by now you guys are getting tired of me saying, align your security with the business goals and objectives. And I understand that. It's just so critical. If you take this exam, keep going back to that. And in the real world, as you're managing IT projects and endeavors, keep going back to business goals and objectives. I had a great question yesterday. Somebody said, or the day before, somebody said, hey, management isn't listening. They don't even care about security. Well, my job is to remind senior leadership in that case how information security delivers value. And that's another bullet point on this slide, or another point on this slide, value delivery. Value delivery, I'm not getting a bargain discount on an ASA firewall. Value delivery means based on business goals, I can show you how this purchase of a firewall gets you closer to your goals. You want to increase profitability? Well, let's get rid of downtime due to external threat. Let's keep, let's prevent some of these attacks that end up costing lots of time and effort, loss of data, right? Let's talk about things in terms of the business. And our information security program starts there with the business. It should also give us a way to manage resources efficiently and effectively. You know how we do that? Our information security program should be based on our risk assessments that we did yesterday. We're directing our money where it's best spent. Right? I don't want to spend a ton of money on a security control that's not mitigating a threat that has, a lot of impact. I want to direct my funds where they're spent best. So all of these elements, I want to point out the second topic from the bottom where it says use performance measurements. This is another piece. This security program is going to be about developing policies, procedures, standards, guidelines, and individual controls, security controls, ways we mitigate risk. And we'll talk about firewalls, and we'll talk about encryption, and we'll talk about intrusion detection systems and all these things. Well, when we have these controls that we implement, there's a purpose. I implement controls for a reason. I want to mitigate risk. So I need to figure out how Risk mitigation is going to be measured and how it's going to be verified. Because if I implement a control, I have an expectation for how that control will work and what it'll do. I can't just implement a control and go, hope it works. I go in and I say, this particular control should prevent access to restricted files as determined by weekly review of audit logs and settings, right? I want to know what we're doing to verify these controls are working. And if possible, we want to include with those metrics. I want to be able to measure. We're going to upgrade the processor on this system and we expect no more than, you know, 30% processor utilization for any sort of sustained period of time. So we set up alerts so that if utilization increases, gets above 30, we're notified and we have a way of measuring and we can say, okay, as within the first quarter, this is the data that we have. Again, that's tied back into delivering value. If we just deliver a product, in information security, we develop a policy or we implement a security device, we have to figure out ways that at the end of the day, we can prove it was a worthwhile endeavor. This really requires that we think about IT and IS projects from a different perspective. We're not just implement, we're implementing to deliver value to the company. So if I'm somebody who sponsored that project, I want when the project's over, you to say, here's the value that we've delivered. We're going to measure this again at the end of first quarter, and I should be able to show you additional value. Realize that doesn't work with every security control, right? But I'm kind of talking about projects that you and certainly programs. But still, even with our small security controls, they have meaning, they have purpose. So how do we make sure that they are serving their purpose, that they're meeting our objectives? We have to evaluate them on a regular basis. And then the last thing provides a means to close the gap. Um, so, security strategy gives us a broad sort of idea of how we're going to close the gap between current state and desired state. These are the details. This is what really has to happen to bring us in current state closer or to desired state. Okay, so looks like I have a little font crisis there. So just pretend that didn't happen. But what we see here is we see the process by which our information security program helps us close the gap. And honestly, this is really just gap analysis, not necessarily just limited to an information security program. But what you'll see is I figure out what the desired state is, figure out what the current state is, gap analysis, and get an action plan. So, how is it I'm going to close that gap while considering risk management and risk assessment? And I develop my program based on the information collected. Right? What is going to be included in my information security policy? What are we addressing? I'm sorry, program. Every now and then I get a slip of the tongue and I might say our information security policy. What we're talking about here is our information security program that may include policies, but is much bigger. So I'm only on my second cup of coffee. So if you say, did she just say policy? Yeah, probably, but I meant program, at least for now. Okay, so we assess our program. We've talked about that. And it's most likely the environment we're coming in, right? Very rarely you're going to walk into a brand new organization that has no information security program. You're going to walk into an organization, and as a CISO that's newly hired, you're going to be tasked with evaluating the existing security program. That's the first thing we do is we come in and we do an assessment. This is also what we're going to do most likely on a yearly basis at least. So, program assessment, where are we now? Current state. What's our organizational culture? We talked about that day before yesterday. Culture is one of the largest influencers on behavior. I tend to act, and we tend to act in conjunction with the culture in which we exist. So if we have a security minded culture, that goes a long way. If our culture is very lax, we better start there because until we change the culture, people aren't going to follow the policies and procedures. They're not going to make good risk aware business decisions. So, what's our culture like and how do we tackle that? Well, can I go from having a very lax security culture to the next day enforcing everything and penalizing users that make any security minded mistake? Well, you can, but that's not the way to do it. That's not effective. So we have to think about ways that we can gradually shift the culture. You can't shift a culture overnight. So, what is it that we need to do that's going to bring the culture to where we want it? Well, senior management has to buy in. Um, so we address the culture. Now, the next thing we have to consider with our information security program is what threats are on the horizon. We looked at our program and where we were, and that assumes, that program was written to address earlier threats. What threats are emerging that we need to expand our program to consider? I have to do some analysis here. What's going on? So we're going to look at our data, we're going to analyze it, we're going to figure out trends that are most likely relevant to us, and we're also going to make sure that we're primed to retrieve data from our security program as we move forward to make sure we can measure the results and that our program development and the individual controls are meeting the goals. We're getting the results we want. And then what do? We train our people and we continually support the education process within the organization. So we continue to learn as security professionals and we continue to share that information along with our team members. And ultimately, at the end of the day, your security program should cover three elements: technology, people, and processes. And I don't love the way this is organized on this slide. And if you're saying, but Kelly, didn't you organize it? Yeah, I did. But as I'm looking at it, really, people should be first, right? Because if we don't hire the right people, if we don't train the people, if we don't monitor the people, have clearly defined roles, have an onboarding process, right? If we're not bringing the right people in the right way through the door, then the technology and processes don't matter, right? Human error is huge. So, how do we limit human error? Well, get the right people in, train them, evaluate them, support them, right? All that goes under people. Now, the people need processes within to work. So, risk management, they need classification policies, change management, the processes that govern their day to day activities. These are business processes. How does the business address risks? How does the business determine how we respond to incidents? These are all processes that are in place. And then technology supports the process. So honestly, if I could click and drag right now, the slides are in read only format. What I'd really do is I'd click and drag technology over behind process. And you can say, you bring the right people in, you make sure you have organizational processes. And in order to support your people and your processes, you bring in technology. Technology really should always be your last decision. I don't walk into a company and say, okay, we need to encrypt everything with RSA 2048 bit encryption. I come into the organization as a security manager, and one of the first things I do is I look at people. That's the greatest weakness of any organization. So, what are the policies that govern, protect, support our people? Then I look at the business processes and I make sure our information security systems support the processes, which support the people. if that makes sense. But it's not like they're going to ask you on the exam, put these in order. But I think that it is a very testable idea that technology is always the final choice. Needs of the business determine what technology we use. And make sure you're really solid on that because they could ask you a question like, when determining biometric solutions. Okay, is everybody with me? This is a test prep hint. And again, I'm not giving you test questions, but this is something I can kind of envision them doing. Okay, so when determining a biometric solution for your organization, what is of least concern? So you're trying to choose a biometric solution. What is least important to you? Cost, accuracy, technology, user acceptance. Cost, accuracy, technology, or user acceptance. So the question is with biometrics, which do you care about? And a lot of times people say user acceptance. No, I want my life is easier if users are not bothered by the security I implement. The answer is actually technology. I care least about what technology we use. What I care about is making sure it's within a cost that I can afford, making sure it's accurate to the degree I need, and that users will accept it. Those three will determine what technology I choose. And I hope that makes sense, but that's the philosophy of this exam. That's the approach. So it's not so much did you memorize A, B, C, and D? Do you really understand that technology should always be the result of analyzing the business? Okay. So just keep rolling right along. Now, I talked to you about SMART objectives yesterday, so I'm just going to leave this there for a second and just very quickly reiterate. Controls should have objectives that should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. So when you're writing objectives for your projects, for your programs, success factors, and objectives for the project, make sure you're using SMART objectives. Make sure during the course of the project you're measuring to make sure the controls are meeting their objectives and that you're delivering value. Value, value, value. Okay. Now, again, going back to the question I had the other day, that was really as much a comment as everything. And like I said, they were essentially saying senior management doesn't always give you buy in for security. My job to convince them then. So how do I convince them? Value delivery. I show them the value. So a business case. Now, this is a document that I would use, and of course, I've just given you the table of contents. We don't go in depth here, but I just want you to kind of visualize this is a document that I provide that says, look, I always love documents that start with an executive summary. I'm a tiny little bit ADHD. I'm sure you would never guess that. Oh, look, a squirrel. But I love the executive summary because 90 times out of 100, I just am like, just get to the point. All right. So we start that executive summary, but what we really get into the nitty gritty is where you say, here's the issue. This is what our project will do to solve the issue. So what you see down here at level 3, so just some broad stuff up at 1, and then we specify who the team is. But at level 3, problem definition, problem statement. What is our problem? Don't get into the solution here. So my problem isn't that I want to migrate to the cloud. My problem is that our data is not accessible as easily as we would like. Vendors are complaining that we have issues with availability. We have been subject to a data breach. Those are the problems that we're trying to fix. Or a recent audit detailed a number of ways that we were out of compliance with regulations pertinent to our industry. Those are problems. The solution is then stated in the project overview. Here's what I'm going to do about that project. Sometimes we try to get it all done in a sentence or paragraph. Separate problem from solution. When I clearly state the problem, I get my head around the problem, and that better enables me to determine the appropriate solution. I don't know if that makes sense, but that just reminds me when I was it's been a little while, but I was picking my son up from aftercare at school, and I got to chatting. This was when he was in preschool, actually, and I got to chatting with the director of the school, and I made the mistake of telling her what I did for a living. I'm going to go back to telling people I wait tables. Because when I say, oh, I wait tables, nobody says, hey, will you go fix me a glass of tea? But if you tell them you work in IT, the next thing they say is, oh, well, let me ask you something. And I'm fine with that, but it's one of those things you can come to predict. So anyway, she said, so we're thinking about migrating our data and services to the cloud. Do you have any suggestions? Now, obviously, she talked a little bit more about that, but that was the gist of it. Now, that's an incredibly broad question. Do you have suggestions about migrating to the cloud? Right? But the thing is if she had come to me as a customer and said, "Hey, Kelly, I want to hire you to migrate us to the cloud," I shouldn't just jump and start migrating. What I should do is say, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And if she comes back and tells me, well, we're having some issues with security and we've had some data compromise. Well, I can think of a lot of ways to make your data more secure than putting it up on the internet, right? Or accessible through the internet. So, what would have happened if that had been her primary goal? I would have done what she asked me to do, but I wouldn't have done what she needed me to do, if that makes sense. And sometimes in project management, we start with our requirements by essentially just writing down what the customer says they want. Customers understand their problems, they understand what's wrong. Sometimes they don't understand what's right. For instance, if I go into a car mechanic and I say, I need you guys to fix my thermal flux capacitor. I think I know what I need. Why? Because I've searched out on the internet, right? How searching makes us experts now. And I go into my car repair shop and I say, well, the engine's knocking, so I think there's a kink in the thermal flux capacitor. And if that even were a thing, my mechanic could replace that. And then I drive off the parking lot and I still hear that knocking noise. So instead, I come in and I report the problem to the mechanic. And the mechanic, who's the expert, figures out the solution. So we should approach our problems, our projects, our endeavors that same way. We document the problem and then we take a look at the problem and figure out the best solution. So if you look at point 3 here in the table of contents, define the problem. And then number 4, this project in the description is going to specify how the project solves the problem. Okay, so it's just one of these considerations that we want to make sure that we follow because that helps us write a better business case, which gives us a greater chance of having our projects approved and signed off on and funded, right? And we've got a budget. We've got to have a budget for developing our information security program. Nothing is free. And we got to think about what's necessary to develop the program. So it's going to take time, it's going to take research, it's going to take resources. We're going to have to analyze data. There's a lot that goes into creating the program. It's a major project. As a matter of fact, it may be a program that's broken down into little mini projects. But then also maintaining the program throughout the year, monitoring and evaluation, training. So this is expensive, especially if we are shifting our information security program dramatically, or if the prior program was ineffective and had a lot of holes in it. So we need a budget. Now, when we talk about budgeting for IT, IS, other departments, we generally either do that incrementally or having a zero-based budget. So basically, with incremental budgeting, we look at what we spent last year and we say, okay, that's a good starting point, but this year we're going to need so much more additional funds, so many more additional funds because of this, and this. So you start at what you spent last year and then build. Or we can start with zero-based funding or budgeting that just basically says, okay, let's start from scratch. What are our expenses? What do we need? So incremental, you're looking at last year as a guide. Zero-based, you start from scratch. And then also, of course, we approach this from the standpoint of looking at fiscal years, which do not align with the calendar year always, and actually quite often. So there is a 12-month period that we budget for, that we report on, and that's the fiscal year. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, but it often doesn't coincide with calendar year. We also have to think about our expenses and how those expenses are going to need to be paid or addressed. So we have capital expenses and we have operational expenses. So your capital expenses are those big lump sums you pay upfront. And then your operational expenses are ongoing. So if I go out and buy a car, that's a capital expense. If I decide instead to rent a car, then that's an operational expense. When we talk about migrating to the cloud, a lot of times what we're doing is trading in these capital expenses for operational expenses. So instead of me spending all this money up front to build a data center, to buy equipment, um, and install equipment and software and all these elements, instead I lease on a monthly or quarterly basis these services from a cloud service provider. At the end of the day, do I necessarily save money? Sometimes, but not always. Mhm. So it is a trade-off and we have to evaluate. And a lot of times as senior executives, we prefer the operational expenses because we don't have to justify this huge chunk of money and remove that from our budget. So a lot of times we do make those trade-offs. And it's not a right or a wrong answer, it's just a way of doing business. All right. All right. All right. Now we're coming up to information asset identification and classification, and this is a really super important kind of topic here. So let's just get our quick morning break, our first break out of the way so that we can come back and focus on this. And the translation for that is I have had too much coffee and need just a little break. So why don't we do this? I've got that it's 12:13 Eastern time. Why don't we come back at 12:20 and we'll pick up talking about information assets, how we identify and classify them. All right, so please return at 12. Actually, you know what? It's already 12:15. Please return at 12:25. Let's just do that. Let's just take our normal break. Let's be back at 12:25. All right, guys, we'll see you in just Alrighty, welcome back from our quick break. And we were just moving up to, we just defined a security program and talked about why we need one and our general broad approach. Now let's look at some of the elements of our security program. And as I've been going along this week talking about security, the one of the consistent themes has been start with your assets. What is it that we're protecting and what are they worth? Because if I don't start there, then I'm going to wind up spending too much or not enough on security, right? I have to have a good understanding of what I'm protecting and what it's worth. This is just one of the elements that that a classification scheme is going to provide for me. So I can't make security decisions until I know what I'm protecting and its value. Now, with let's see where I want to get. Okay, this is where the slide that I want to look at. Okay, now this is just kind of a data classification scheme. Every organization is going to have something different. You may have a more formalized document. This might just be an upper level kind of guidance. But again, remember that it's the data owner that's going to be following this scheme, but they have to have a scheme to follow. So we don't just put it on the data owner and say, what do you think this is worth? Right? We provide them the criteria and the guidelines. So, first of all, of course, the data owner is going to determine what's important, but how important, and I don't even like the word important, what's its value, right? Because value can be tied into um, value to customers. It could be tied into value to competitors. It could be tied into liability. It could be something that would impact public perception, even if it wouldn't cost us money up front. So let's stick with the word value. So, data owner determines what their assets are and then uses a predefined scheme to determine the value. And remember, in information security, we're looking at three main elements: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA triad. And that's always what we come back to. Um, Now, once we take a look at that, we're looking at just a qualitative assessment of the value of data. Now, what does that really mean? So we define, okay, high, medium, and low so that I can look at my asset and determine where it really fits per the category. And then down below, you see we provide additional guidance that says, okay, so how do I know if it's low, medium, or high? Well, these are some guidelines. These are some considerations. Well, what about with integrity? So this really is a good starting point for developing my classification scheme. But this just helps me with determining the value of assets right now. So if you're thinking about this from a government perspective, FIPS 199 provides this. The government, when we look to figure out the value of our assets, we think about categorizing assets based on value. So FIPS 199 defines what's low, medium, and high and helps you determine what the overall categorization should be for your assets. Not for the test. You don't need to know FIPS 199 for the test, but I just want you to visualize if I'm in the government, I have a document I can go to very similar to this that tells me, that spells it out for me. Now, once I determine the value, the category of my asset, then I have to secure it. That's where I implement controls. So NIST 800 53 is the document I would go to again in the government, where I would say, okay, I've got assets of this value. How do I protect it? So if we look at the way this document is, NIST 800 53 has 18 security control families. So, what that means is essentially 18 elements of security that are specified per NIST 800 53. Now, if we look at these, not testable for the exam, but again, I just want you to visualize the support that's necessary for a classification scheme. you can see the categories of controls. So everything from access control, planning, physical security, um, media protection, personnel security, all of those elements are just categories of controls. And of course, there are individual security controls within. So under access control, you might see something like multi-factor authentication. Under risk assessment, you're going to see a risk management framework. So there will be individual controls underneath. All right. Now, the bottom line is the reason we have classification schemes is to provide us guidance on how to protect our assets, right? We don't have classification just to classify. I don't just say, look, this is top secret data. That doesn't do me any good. I might say this is top secret data, so I will protect it a certain way. And since we continue to look at government and military usage here in the US, I'll just mention that NIST also provides a cybersecurity framework that essentially says our controls are going to provide different functions, and we've got to kind of consider that NIST 800-33 and the roles those functions will play. I would know what the cybersecurity framework is as far as testability. You're in a US government environment and have been asked to choose a framework that will help you establish an information security program, CSF, cybersecurity framework. But getting into the details of what category does risk management fall under and where would you see auditing and those, that's not testable. So really this slide right here is just to give you again visualization. What do we need to do in security for NIST cybersecurity framework? Well, we first have to identify what's important to us, our assets, what are their values, what's the context of our environment, what do we already have in place, what's our strategy, identification. Well, then the next thing we move into is protecting those assets based on what we learned in identification phase or the identify phase. So we implement proactive controls. And proactive controls are designed to prevent the risk event from happening. Um, so if we look at proactive controls, we would think of preventive controls and we would think of deterrent controls. So a deterrent discourages an attacker. A preventive control will stop them at least temporarily. So if you think about preventing an attack, a locked door is a preventive control. Not because it can't be bypassed, because we know it can, but because it will physically stop an attacker. Now, motion detector lights, or not even motion detector lights, a well-lit environment is a deterrent. And they both are geared towards keeping the event from happening, um, you know, ahead of time. An ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure. So, if you kind of frame that in your mind, obviously we want to put a lot of effort up front. But we also know no matter what we do up front, that nothing's foolproof. So I put this emphasis on protecting my assets, but I also have detective means so that if my assets are compromised anyway, I can detect that as quickly as possible and move into response, incident management and response, where I take what I learned from detection, I commission my incident response team to go out and assess and triage, and then ultimately respond. And then the last phase here is to recover. So, response, we're trying to eradicate the problem. Recover, we want to get back to a point of permanence. So this is just another framework. I really could have put this in the frameworks that we were looking at on Monday, but I just wanted to put it here because it certainly focuses on the implementation of controls in order to provide security. All right, now our security controls. This is funny. We we are going to look at operational controls, management controls, and for whatever reason, physical controls. I think I had maybe a copy and paste crisis where I didn't paste it, but operational, management, and technical. Those are our three types of controls. I actually think I probably have that in black font on a black background. I think that's what happened. But operational, management, technical controls. So categories of controls, and the idea is no one control type is going to fully protect an asset. So if you think of managerial controls, you kind of think of policies and procedures, those things that senior management sets forth. Operational controls are sort of these departmental controls, like um, or these types of controls that are implemented by individuals as opposed to like technology. So, like auditing is an operational control. Incident response is an operational control. And then technical things like encryption and IDS. But the bottom line is no one of these is going to protect your asset fully. So layered security and defense in depth really require that we have multiple types of control to provide a more balanced protection. So we're going to start off here with talking about management controls. And management controls, you can kind of think of policy, right? Policy that comes from senior management starts us off with our management controls. And then when we get down to procedures, we're not so much looking at senior management, but more functional management, but still management in general, these organizational documents that mandate how activity within our environment is going to happen and what the expectations are. So if we start out with policy, you may hear on the exam organizational policy, or they may say corporate policy. And corporate policy is just a very broad document that details or provides the structure for the support of security within the organization. So if we talk about our organizational security policy, we here at Kelly.com are committed to protecting the privacy of customer information. We will encrypt all user data, ensure there's strong access control, and blah blah blah. So notice with my policy, I didn't get into detail. I didn't get into technology. I didn't give specifics. That's true of policy. Policy is not going to contain a lot of details. It's not going to get real nitpicky about schedules and what type of encryption and how often we're going to back up. A policy may say we will ensure redundancy for customer data, but it's not going to go into the details of how. Standards are going to provide the details of policy. So on our corporate policy, we may say that we're going to encrypt all patient data. The standard then is going to say we're going to encrypt all patient data using AES 256, right? So standards fill in the details of policy. Policy is going to say we're going to ensure availability of data. The standard's going to say we're going to back up using McAfee, and we're going to back up data on a nightly basis. Standards will fill in the details of policy. The idea behind policies is your policy shouldn't have to change that frequently, right? We're going to encrypt patient data. When is that not going to be the case? So I'm not going to be changing my policies every other week. My standards are going to change much more frequently, though. Okay, and that's true with system-specific policies and issue-specific policies as well. They're broadly written. And then standards will fill in the details. And that's where we're going to see more change. All right, so system-specific policies and issue-specific policies, just what they sound like. I will have policy for specific systems on the network. Not all systems are treated equally. I'm going to secure my database servers differently than my domain controllers, differently than my end user workstations. So we'll have different policies based on systems. And then there are various issues that arise within an organization. And those are our issue-specific policies. Now, I have a couple of issue-specific policies listed out here. So over on the left, I've given you some examples of system-specific policies that go along with what I said. They're just going to be broad, Standards will fill in the details, and that's true of issue-specific policies as well. So let's take a look at these over on the right because they are so relevant for the CISM exam. And I think, as managers, this is one of the better ways that we can influence culture and security within our organization is beginning with policy. Now, of course, we have to enforce that policy. Before we can enforce it, we have to educate and train our employees. But those are ways that we can impact company culture is we specify out what our priorities are and how we're going to address those priorities in our policies. We train our people, we enforce our policies. I was going to sneeze, but it just didn't happen. All right. First bullet point under issue specific policies. I just want to give you a word or two about these. Change management policies. Change management policies make sure that users are unable to make changes to baseline configurations with systems. You know, I don't want my users, for instance, in my environment, my change management policy says users can't install applications. You need an application installed, come see me, I'll install it on your system. Um, we don't allow users to change configuration settings on their system. I don't allow them to delete elements or modify elements in the control panel, whatever that may be. That change management gives us security through stability. So the goal of change management actually is security. A stable environment is easier to secure. So change management says, yeah, if you want to make changes, there's a process. You write that change up, you submit it to a change control board, they approve it, the change gets tested, and then we're going to roll it out. So no changes on the fly. The assumption is I already have a comprehensive baseline image that we think is going to meet users' needs. And if they need to modify that image, then we need to have a process for that to happen. All right, change management. Next one, acceptable use policy. That's a resource policy. And with that resource policy, ultimately, what it does is it's going to provide users guidance for how to use company resources. Can you make long distance phone calls on the company phones? Can you send personal material to company printers? Can you browse the internet at break or not at break? Those are all acceptable use policies. How do you use company resources? What are you allowed to do and what is disallowed? All right, privacy. Now, immediately we start thinking about protecting the privacy of customers and patient data and so on. But here I actually mean this in relation to protecting the privacy for our employees. So the question then being, do employees expect privacy in the workplace? Do employees expect privacy in the workplace? They do. Doesn't mean they should. It doesn't mean I have to guarantee them privacy in the workplace. But people expect privacy. If I'm going to infringe upon employee privacy, they must be notified. Can't stress that enough. Do I have the right to monitor what goes on my systems? Yes, if I alert users and let them know that monitoring is ongoing. Can I read users' emails that they send out from their company mail application on their company systems? Yes, if they're notified. And I don't want to just notify them on page 263 of the employee handbook. I want to sit them down as they're onboarding with the company. I want to talk about that. I want to get them to sign a waiver acknowledging that that's going to happen and that's with their consent so that we don't run into any issues if there's an investigation that winds up happening later. So In most situations, we can infringe upon the privacy, but we need to notify. All right, data and system ownership. A lot of times, the data owner is the system owner. But if there's ever a decision to be made, if for whatever reason, like there might be multiple data owners storing data on a database. So you may have a database owner that's different than the individual data owner. The data owner always wins when it comes to decisions. Why? Because that system is only significant based on the data stored on that system. So we don't make systems about this, HP, uh, you know, 4 gigahertz processing, 64 gigs of RAM. This system, we make decisions based on the data on the system. So data owner wins. Another question that comes up, or another idea that comes up. All right. Separation of duties is a big one that's frequently talked about in the course material. Um, the word I want you to associate with separation of duties, or the phrase separation of duties, is all about collusion. And sometimes you might hear it uh, said that it forces collusion. Now, that was always kind of a weird phrase for me because the first time I heard separation of duties forces collusion, my thought was, well, why would you want to do that? Collusion's bad, right? Collusion is multiple people coming together to commit fraud. It's never coming together for good. It's always to carry out fraud. So why do I want to force it? Well, the idea is that if people are going to commit fraud, I'd rather them to have to collude with each other rather than being able to commit fraud by themselves. So, for instance, any company you go to, the person that prints checks is not the same person that signs checks. That's separation of duties. And if I print the checks, I would have to talk somebody else into colluding with me if we were to get away with a bunch of checks, a bunch of company money. So we want to force collusion, and that means multiple roles are necessary, usually for a specific function if fraud is to be committed. And that goes along the line of a little bit in line with dual control. So I don't let any one individual perform by themselves a very significant function. So just like two signatures needed to deposit a a check over a certain amount of money, right, from the bank manager and the teller or whatever those signatures are required. But the idea that multiple parties are involved. So separation of duties forces collusion. A lot of times dual control is about preventing abuse of power. They're very closely related. All right, mandatory vacations. Many of us would love a mandatory vacation, but just can't seem to get one, right? But mandatory vacations, that's a security control that shows up most of the time in the banking industry. So if I go get hired at a bank, for instance, the manager's going to say, Kelly, welcome aboard. You're going to get 10 days off. Now, 5 of those days must be taken in consecutive order. And during those 5 days in consecutive order, you may not remotely access your system. You may not physically access your system. You may not contact another employee of the bank. You may not show up at the physical location of the bank or any of our banks. You must be totally out of the office, totally away from the organization. Because that way, if the bank's coming up a couple $100 short every week, all of a sudden Kelly's out of the office and it balances to the penny. It's a pretty good detective control in place. So mandatory vacations are detective, and just about the only time you see them is in the financial industries. Another detective control is job rotation. Now, it actually has two functions because job rotation gives me cross training. That's going to give me a higher availability for my personnel, so that's great. But it also provides a detective control in that, I'm in a job for 6 months and I'm shifted to another department or another role. Whoever steps in behind me can detect any mistakes or any fraudulent activity. So it's detective, but it's also a good proactive control, particularly with things like disaster recovery planning. So many times we're focusing on the business processes that we have to restore and the systems that have to be restored. But if I don't have somebody that can run those systems, it doesn't matter if the systems are up, right? So job rotation gives me cross training and redundancy of staff. All right. Principle of least privilege and need to know. Principle of least privilege is about action. Need to know is about data. So least privilege, what can I do? A minute ago, I told you I don't allow users to install applications. That's the principle of least privilege. The user doesn't need to install an application. If they need it, they come to me. That's true in many of the environments I work in, not every. Okay. Now, need to know, if you're not on the sales team, you don't get access to sales data. And that's need to know. So the two have the same purpose, but least privilege is about action, need to know is about data. Okay, now we said dual control is requiring two parties to uh, perform a function. Like if you see those movies where there's a madman who's going to launch the bomb and they go down into the cellar and there are two keys that have to be turned simultaneously on separate sides of the room. So one person couldn't do that on their own. That's dual control. M of N control, with dual control, usually you name the two individuals required. So, in order to recover an archived private key, maybe John and Schmidt have to be there to, to recover a private key. The problem is, what if John's not working that day? So, what M of N controls, it says out of however many admins you have, any 3 or any 2 or any 6, they're just variables, right? So any 2 out of 8 administrators can be present for this action to be performed. So it's more flexible than dual control. I will just mention, thou shalt know these policies. These are foundational building blocks for our security programs. The policies, again, are going to give us that guidance for our standards, procedures, guidelines, and controls. So my acceptable use policy says users cannot print personal material to the company printer. Well, I'm going to have to figure out then what controls will prevent that from happening. So your policies give us the guidance. Even though senior management isn't there fervently scribbling out these policies by hand, they will sign off on the policies and the information security program as a whole. Okay? Most likely you and I as CISOs or as CISMs even are going to be responsible for the actual writing of these policies, and then we get feedback from senior management. All right, now like I said, standards, these fill in the details of policies. Policies are mandatory, standards are mandatory. And then we have procedures that give the step-by-step directions. So a policy might say we're going to provide redundancy for patient data. The standard may say we're going to use McAfee backup program once a night or every night. The procedure is going to be, run this, configure it such and such way. Here's how we'll test, right? It's the details of how you're going to perform and what tasks are necessary. And then guidelines are the only one of those that's not mandatory. And when we talk about guidelines, guidelines are suggestions, they're best practices. They're those things we should do, but not must do. In order to improve security awareness, we recommend employees attend training whenever possible, right? Things like we recommend whenever possible. Those are words that tell you we're looking at a guideline, right? So it's that kind of suggestive language. Excuse me, the sniffles. Okay, baselines. Now, baselines can be used a couple of different ways. So, one of the ways we might talk about a baseline is we might look at it as the typical performance. So, if I talk about baseline performance of a system, how does it function normally? Right? So, what's the network utilization? What's the processor utilization? What's the virtual memory access? What's this? What's that? How does it perform in a normal environment? And once I understand baseline performance, now when these anomalies happen, I'm able to say, wait, that's an anomaly. Let's investigate that a little bit further. Anything that's out of the baseline, outside of a certain threshold, we probably want to investigate. I can't make that decision unless I know what the baseline is. So that's one usage of the term baseline. I think you could see that certainly, but another usage of that word would also be the minimum acceptable security configuration. So, for instance, when I set up an end user workstation, there's a baseline image. Usually, this is pushed out through virtual drives or through images that basically, here's the image for this system configured exactly as we want it based on our minimum acceptable needs. So we have the system patched, we have things locked down, we've renamed administrative accounts, all those things. And then that baseline we want to lock down. I don't want, remember, change management says if you're going to make changes to the baseline, there's a process for approval and for implementation. So our baseline is going to be our minimum standard security configuration. So when we have categorizations of data like top secret, confidential, whatever, we will have baseline configuration for top secret systems, for secret systems, for confidential systems, and so on. It's just a little graphic, a little visual that kind of helps you see. All right, we start with drivers to the organization, stakeholders' needs, laws and regulations, industry standards. And we develop the principles, not, senior leadership does, board of directors, senior leadership, the principles. This is how our organization will operate. That's going to give way to policies where we address um, our approach and our commitment to things like security. Standards fill in the details. Procedures tell us how. Baselines give us a de facto standard configuration that will go no lower than, and then guidelines are suggestions. I think that's just a good kind of summary chart for us. Now, another element of a security program is we need well-defined roles and responsibilities. First thing on Monday, we kind of talked about roles within the organization. We kind of focused on governing roles like the chief executive officer, chief operating, chief financial, chief risk, chief security, all those. So as we come down from senior leadership's hierarchy, or really, we could look at this in terms of project management, program management, but those roles and responsibilities need to be defined. So that if I am hired as a CISO, I have documentation that describes my job responsibilities. Now, a quick, easy tool that we can use just to kind of say, okay, what's what, is called a RACI matrix. And RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consult, and inform. These are really valuable on projects because you may be working with project team members that come from other departments or even outside the organization, and being able to know who's going to get the work done, who's accountable, who do we need to inform that decisions have been made. So we can use them in our typical environment. We can use them within departments. We can use them with projects and programs. But responsible, accountable, consult, inform. If it were up to me, I would call it an ARCHI matrix because I always think of accountable being above responsible. It's not really always the case, but the accountable person is the decision maker. They are the ones you go to with issues. They're accountable. So in this case, for accountable, our data owner would be accountable for security. But they're not the one that implements security. That's who's responsible. Responsible folks are the ones that they're the worker bees. They do the work. So the data owner who's accountable is going to choose the right security options, and the data custodian is going to implement those security options. Now, the data owner may consult other departments before the decisions are made to get their feedback, and then there are other departments they may inform after the decision is made. But it's certainly better if I have this tool in my pocket, so when these decisions come up, I know who to go to for what sort of input. And that's called a RACI matrix. And those are our management controls. Now, of course, we could spend weeks talking about management controls. There are a million of them. There are subtleties in different types of controls. There's subtleties between different types of policies and so on. But this is the appropriate level for where we want to be for the CISM exam. All right. So we move on to our operational controls. And these are kind of the responsibility of people within the organization to manage. So not so much a technology control that is like encryption, that's done with the system, right? But operational controls have to be defined and implemented by people. Okay. Um, so we have a list of operational controls here. Go back. And I just want to, I'm not going to read every single one of these or spend equal amount of time on them all. But as far as operational controls go, every bit as valuable as management controls, every bit as valuable as technical controls. Again, it's not that we want to choose one or the other, but we want a layered defense. So within our organization, we have to have a policy for how we're going to manage identity and access to resources. So when we talk about identity, when you come on board, how do I make sure you're really who you say you are? Well, I'm going to check your driver's license or passport. I'm going to look for a social security card, a driver's license. And it's a piece called identity proofing. It's done before you're ever given an account on the network. Okay. Then the next step is I need to create you an account. And I want to do that as seamlessly as possible. So we get accounts provisioned automatically if possible. Now, as far as the access management piece, okay, so you've now proven you are who you say you are. You've been granted an account. Now you go to access a resource. Well, you're going to have to tell that resource or enter in your identity. I'm Kelly H. And then you're going to be authenticated. You're going to have to prove that identity with a password or a thumbprint or a secret code, whatever. And we know that the best form of authentication is multi-factor, making sure a user gives you a combination of something they know, have, and are. Okay, any combination of those three. So identify, I'm Kelly H. I give you a password and a thumbprint for multi-factor authentication. And then I'm authorized. And being authorized means I'm allowed to perform certain actions on the network. A lot of times that's determined by role. It's called role-based access control. Because I'm a manager, by default, I can access these resources. Because I'm an administrator, I can access these resources or perform these functions. So role-based access control is a good way to kind of manage those access permissions. And then we also have to make sure that at the end of the day, we can audit our users and we can hold them accountable for whatever actions happen. And then as a user leaves the organization, we need a means for deprovisioning. So all of these little elements fall under the category of identity and access management. When you move into a course like CISSP or you move into cloud-based classes and so on, this becomes a very, very large topic because there's a lot that has to happen to make this streamlined, to make it work, and not just work within our organization, but out across other organizations. That's beyond the scope of where we're going in this class, but identity and access management is a really hot field right now, and that's just going to increase. All right, event monitoring. We got to monitor events, right? What events? How often? What tools do we use? That should be specified in our policies, right? And really, our policies say we're going to monitor events. Our standards are going to give us the details. Our procedures are going to tell us what tools to use and what we're looking for and how we analyze the data and so on. But we need event monitoring in place. Talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, talked about configuration and change management. Remember the phrase, security through stability. A stable environment is easier to secure. So, when we restrict changes to configuration or to the systems or the images themselves, uh, if we're developing software, we make sure that the software doesn't just get updated haphazardly. We get greater stability, greater security in a stable environment. As a matter of fact, let me just show you something. One of the first things, something I totally remember and will probably remember forever, is I was working as help desk really early on. So we're back in the 90s. And I got a call from an end user that basically said, I've got really bad performance here. Well, I kind of laugh at that now because back in the 90s, we had 1 meg of RAM and we were happy to have 1 meg of RAM, right? So performance, of course, was an issue, but we didn't know at the time how bad the performance was, right? Is all we knew. So anyway, I have this end user call and say, "Yeah, I'm having some performance issues on my system. Can you come down and take a look?" Yeah, sure, whatever. Now, what cracked me up though, do any of you remember back from the 90s, there was this little gadget, this little thing you could install called the Bonsai Buddy. Let me show you the Bonsai Buddy. Okay, dear friends, this was the Bonsai Buddy. So this beloved creature, people would install it on their systems. And one of the things you can see all the crazy stuff, so it'll just pop up randomly with a joke or make a random sound and all this crazy stuff. But at the very least, what it would do is it would follow your mouse around. So if I would move my mouse up into the upper right-hand corner, that little monkey was just following my mouse. And then I move it over here and then I move it down here. So we have 1 meg of RAM. Woman installs this on her system and can't figure out why performance is bad. As soon as I got to the system, I'm like, I know this one. Well, we can kind of thumb our nose at end users, but do what they want to do, right? Workday gets boring, they're going to find a way to goof off. Our organization's change management system should have never allowed that to happen. The user shouldn't be able to bring in garbage from home or download garbage from the internet and install it on a system. System should be locked down so that that doesn't happen. Once you start downloading and allowing users to install whatever they want, they're going to bring in stuff with garbage on it, with viruses and malware. So the importance, that's how change management provides security for a system, is it keeps malware and, other garbage off of a system that is already configured according to baseline, right? It keeps risks from being introduced into a stable environment. Don't let users install stuff like that. And don't trust that they won't either. All right, we got to patch our systems. We keep operating systems performing well. I think, patches are always essential that we talk about because most of the vulnerabilities that get exploited often There have been patches to shore up those holes months before the system is exploited. But patch management can be difficult because there's so many patches for so many products out there. But we have to have a way that addresses patches, allows patches to be tested based on the type of patch, allows them to be prioritized, and that should be part of our patch management strategy. Vulnerability management. How do we assess our systems? How do I know if users have reconfigured their systems? Right? I thought I prevented it by the controls and policies I put in place, but I still need to make sure that's not the case, or that that's the case. They're still secure. How do I make sure users aren't using lousy passwords? How do I make sure that data isn't being sent or stored unencrypted? Well, I look for those weaknesses and I conduct vulnerability assessments. And usually that's just sort of a passive scan looking for known weaknesses. I may take that a step further with penetration testing. I found the weaknesses. Now I need to know if the weaknesses can be exploited. So that's part of due diligence, is to assess my network and determine what vulnerabilities exist. Okay. Secure engineering and development. If we go back to yesterday when we looked at the software and system development lifecycle, and we said that we need to introduce risk management into all phases of the lifecycle. And we looked at how the risk management framework and the software development lifecycle go together so that we can develop a secure system instead of a system that we now have to secure. It's always better when we build security into the system or software package or whatever. Now, another part of secure engineering means that I assess threats, right? I conduct a threat assessment for what are the most likely threats against the data, or what are the most likely threats for misuse of this software package. So when you're talking about the software development process and you're talking about the end result of software, the STRIDE threat model is frequently used. And so STRIDE, STRIDE, each letter stands for a threat, like spoofing, right? Tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, escalation of privilege. So those are the 6 most common threats for software. And then on this chart, I've just got a quick little note about how you're going to address them. We don't get into software development here, but this idea of threat modeling, like on the test, they're not going to say, what does the R in the STRIDE model stand for? But what is, how, what's a technique for determining threats that might impact risks associated with software development? Oh, well, threat modeling. Okay. So, more concept and less memorization. I know I've said that. All right. Auditing. We said auditing is operational controls. We have an auditing team. And the main point here, auditors are looking for compliance. When you hear compliance, think audit. When you hear assurance or third-party assurance, think audit. So your audit team is verifying compliance. Maybe internal audits looking to see, are you in compliance with internal policies and procedures? Are you conducting this audit with your own internal team, or external audits, which you might use to verify compliance with contracts? And then third party audits are generally what we consider audits against laws and regulations. Are you in compliance with HIPAA? Are you compliant with Graham-Leach-Bliley or Sarbanes-Oxley or whatever? So there are different types of audits depending on what our needs are, but ultimately what we're doing is we're verifying compliance. That's our job. That's what we're trying to do. Now, we also within our organization need third-party governance. We are almost assuredly at some point in time going to need to procure resources outside of our internal environment. So how do we do that? How do we determine what to outsource? How do we determine if our contracts or if their contracts meet our needs? How do we monitor contracts? How do we make changes to contracts? So third-party governance is going to provide guidance for procurements. Um, how the contracts are written, what types of contracts we use, all that is considered third-party governance. And then we have to have the considerations about liabilities in relation to third-party governance. We have to think about, sometimes vendors outsource to subcontractors who outsource to subcontractors. What are the service level agreements that our vendors going to give us to make sure that they're protecting our resources as we need them to do so, particularly cloud service providers. All that comes from the trustworthy hand of third-party governance. Now, some documents I had mentioned, the procurement department, or I'm sorry, the third-party governance is going to determine what types of contracts as well as what types of procurement documents. So within an organization, if I'm looking at doing business with a vendor, I might use an RFI, request for information. If I haven't worked with that vendor before, I'm going to send out a form and say, hey, fill this out for me. And I want to know how long that company's been in business, who their principal um, officers are. I want to know details about their business. So I'm just gathering information, a request for information. Now, a request for quote, I need 10 Dell computers. What are you going to charge me? Pretty straightforward. This is the product I need. Give me a quote for the price. A request for proposal is on a much larger scope. So I need you to upgrade my network infrastructure. So tell me your methodology, your approach. Tell me what you're going to do. And then an invitation for bid, once again, for very large scale amounts of work, I will allow multiple vendors to bid on the work. And then we need a means for evaluating the bids and determining which vendors to choose. So those are some commonly used documents. Now, when we have our contracts, that's a legal agreement between parties. Couple of types of contracts, memorandums of agreement and understanding. And that's essentially where we detail roles in relation to work to be done. And service level agreements, that's something that could come up. When I go to a cloud service provider, how do I know my assets are protected? I don't. So which service provider do I go to? What sort of assurances do I have? Those come in the service level agreements. And that's part of the overarching contract where we get a commitment to availability and certain elements of security and um, access and as far as redundancy and all this stuff. So the service level agreement is where the vendor makes their commitment to us for things like performance and availability and security. We may want to audit the vendor to make sure they're meeting the rules of the service level agreement. A lot of times we don't have that ability to just walk in and audit. So if that's the case, we would look for third-party assurance. I would look for a provider that can show me their audit results. Sometimes we talk about SOC reports, service organizational control reports, or cloud service providers might use the STAR Alliance to, kind of provide third-party assurance that they're meeting their requirements. Okay. Please focus more on threat modeling, more information to fix threats. So you know what? Here's what I can do. I can stick around for a little bit after the course and get a little bit more information from you. It's a very high level topic here with CISM, as most things are with CISM. So if maybe you can give me some details on what information you need. But as far as the CISM exam, just understanding that with risk management, our risks are made up of three elements: threats, vulnerabilities, and an asset. So when we talk about threat modeling, we're looking at what our project or endeavor is. We generally start with um, the asset, and we build from that. A lot of this was kind of considered when we talked about NIST 800-30 and NIST 800-39 yesterday about the process and the process of determining what threats exist, and then how we determine, how that creates a risk, how we determine the value of the risk, and how we respond. So there are all sorts of different tools that we can use. Our standards are going to define which tools that we use. Due diligence requires that we have a degree of, we have a process for threat intelligence. It requires that we have tools. It requires that we can demonstrate we're educating ourselves in relation to threats. But as far as any specific processes or details of threat modeling or you know, how to run a scan of your system to detect threats. That's beyond kind of what we do here, but I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes after class and kind of answer anything directly. I'd be more than happy to do that. All right? Okay. Service level agreements, talk about contracts. Last thing I'm going to mention here and not going to spend a ton of time on, but IT service management. Everything is a service today. Um, when we talk about cloud services, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, right now you're getting Kelly as a service. It used to be that I would show up at your office and teach an in person course. Now you're accessing this course over the internet. So we'll call it CAS, Kelly as a service, right? But the idea is that these services have to have management of the processes and if you're familiar with ITIL, IT Infrastructure Library, it's all about managing IT services. And then, of course, metrics and monitoring, we've talked about that. Any controls we implement, we need to have objectives that we monitor against. Mm, Okay, I think that's a good spot to take a quick Yeah, let's do that. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about other operational controls, specifically certification and accreditation, with the idea that we have built a secure system. Now, how do we make sure it really is a secure system? Right? So technical assessments and then management's acceptance of the product and how that works. So that's what we'll talk about when we come back. Let's take a 10-minute break. Let's be back at 1:35 and we will pick up right where we left off. All right, everybody, have a good 10-minute break. We'll be right back. Hello, hello. Ah, there we go. It's amazing how that mute button works, isn't it? That I can talk all I want to, but if I'm muted, nobody hears it. So anyway, yeah, so welcome back from break. And I was just saying, we've been talking about the type of controls that are going to be implemented through our security program. And we started out with administrative controls and we said senior leadership, or we started out with management. They're also called administrative controls, so you could see either administrative or management controls are going to get us started with our policies, procedures, standards, guidelines, and baselines as well. And that's management's input on the security program. Policies are going to detail expectations in a very broad level. Standards fill in the details. Procedures tell us how, and guidelines are best practices. So we started out with our administrative controls, and now we're moving through our operational controls. So these operational controls are generally handled by departments within the organization as opposed to being implemented from a technical perspective. So, that's about the best definition that I've found for operational controls. Is sometimes they're a little bit, it seems a little bit odd. Um, they can be a little bit hard to define, but these are the types of controls implemented by departments, by individuals, by people within the organization. So we had talked about change management and patch management. Prior to break, we were just looking at service management, third party governance, and that brought us up to, we've already talked about our SMART objectives, that brings us up to talking about certification and accreditation. So we've done a lot in discussing um, or in focusing on the idea that we want a product that's secure by design. We want secure software. We want secure systems. And the best way to make that happen is to design them to be secure. Well, let's say I've done that. I've designed a secure software package. I've designed a secure system. Now what? I can't just give it to my customer and say, I promise you, this is really secure, especially if I'm doing business with government organizations, with the military. So what we need, again, that idea of third party assurance that our system or software really meets its requirements. So when we talk about the technical evaluation of a product, we're talking about getting that product certified. And in the certification process, that's where penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, and pen tests happen. And there are a set of technical requirements that are verified within the system. Now, once the system is certified, then it goes to senior leadership to determine if senior leadership wants to authorize this product for existence or use in the production environment. And we can call that accreditations, what it used to be called. You'll hear it today, product being authorized. But the idea is authorization or accreditation, whichever term you're going to use, is all about senior leadership's acceptance of the product. So certification, is it secure? Does it meet the developer's description related to the security products of the security description of the product? Accreditation, does senior leadership choose to implement it? Does it solve a real world need? Is it what leadership wants to implement? Now, there are usually guidelines that provide steps or guidance in certifying products. We used to use way back in the day when we were talking about secure systems for use in the government, we used to use something called the Orange Book. And the official name of the Orange Book is the Trusted Computer Security Evaluation Criteria, the TICSEC. And it was called the Orange Book, though, because it was a book that had an orange cover. And it was part of a series of books called the Rainbow Series. And, the book, Assessing a Network was in a red book, and databases were in a purple book, I believe. But at any rate, uh, this orange book provided sort of an evaluation of systems, almost like a report card. If the system had all these functions, one, two, three, four, then that system would be certified as a D level. If it had more functionality and greater security, it'd be a C. Even more security, a B. Even more, an A. So we're kind of like a report card. And then with each category, you could have further requirements. So like a B system might be a B1, 2, or 3, with 3 being the greatest, security. Not testable, but an idea of where we've come from. And the biggest problem with the Orange Book is it was almost like a checklist. And if that system didn't have every box checked, then it might get a poor rating when in fact it might be a really secure system. So that was way too rigid. And what we've come up with now and what we're using in government in environments in order to certify systems is we're using something called the common criteria, almost assuredly going to show up on the exam. And the common criteria is specified by ISO 15408. Or another way to say that might be ISO 15408 describes the common criteria. So when we talk about that, this is a set of procedures or steps in order to get a product certified. And the government agencies usually require common criteria certification in order to introduce a system or software into a particular environment. All right. So it starts off with what's called a protection profile. So a government agency might have a need for a system to exist in a particular environment. Okay. So they have a set of requirements for that system. I need the system to um, provide an audit trail. I need it to have a firewall. I need it to have a special role designated for security administration, whatever those needs are. Okay. And those needs are written up in a document called the protection profile. So the protection profile is the list of requirements from the customer. Now, as a customer, when I say, hey, I need a product that does this, especially if I'm a government agency, when I release a protection profile, vendors want to do business with the government because they can sell a lot of systems. So when that protection profile is released by one of the agencies, vendors build a system to meet the needs of the protection profile. And that system is called a TOE, a target of evaluation. So the customer lists their requirements in a protection profile. The vendor designs a system to meet those needs called a target of evaluation. And then the vendor also provides documentation called a security target that essentially says, look what a great job we did meeting the needs of the protection profile. Okay. Then the auditor comes along and assesses the product for both function and assurance. So function is what does the system do? Assurance is how it was built. What was the testing for the product? How was it evaluated? How was change control managed? What was the process? Okay. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, they're receiving a score, almost, if you will, or a rating, an evaluation assurance level. And that EAL level is from EAL 1 to EAL 7. That indicates the degree to which, whoa, can you guys tell why all of a sudden my slides just went forwarding 50 miles an hour? Let me back up just a little bit. Sorry about that, folks. I have a cat with a broken paw who is very needy right now. So let's just pretend you didn't see that and that she didn't access the keyboard there. So I was just saying that part of the common criteria at the end is an auditor is going to assign an EAL level to the security target. And that security target is going to get an EAL based on how well it meets the protection profile. So EAL 1 is much lower than EAL 7. EAL 7 essentially says that product meets the protection profile through all sorts of testing, and there's a formal verification process for how it was designed and how it was tested. And so that is the highest EAL a product could be awarded. Most of the times for placement in typical government agencies, not classified agencies, but just typical federal systems, the system would need to be an EAL 4 or higher. And if all we need is an EAL 4 to be placed in a government environment, we're not going to spend the time and the effort and the money to get an EAL 7. So this is driven by customer needs. I'm not going to just go out and get an EAL rating for kicks. I'm doing this to increase my customer base. So this might be one of the security things that we do as a direct result tied into business objectives. We decide, hey, there's a whole corner of the market we're not leveraging. So let's get this certified via the common criteria. Now we can sell to government employees. So that's what the common criteria is. Here is something that I don't love, but that could come up. Sometimes they give you a situation and make you choose between ISO 15408 and the common criteria. But Kelly, you just said common criteria and ISO 15408 are the same thing. I didn't actually. So the standard is ISO 15408. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about with standards and policies a minute ago. So the standard defines a requirement for certifying systems. Currently, the way that we certify systems is by using the common criteria. So that's kind of a sneaky and ridiculous question, I think. But the question might be, which of the following specifies protection profiles, targets of evaluation, security targets to um, evaluate a system? And answer A is common criteria, and answer B is ISO 15408. So the answer is the common criteria. Common criteria gives the specifics. The standard just says, it's almost like what we were talking about with policies and standards earlier. ISO 15408 is the structure, but the details come through the common criteria. I think it's ridiculous that they make you split out the two. And even if you go online and Google, they're not going to give you that explanation. So the actual details come in the common criteria. The requirement is set in the ISO 15408. I hope that helps. Silly test writers. They ask silly questions sometimes. Okay, train your people. It's an operational control also. Oh, hang on just one second. Okay, sorry about that. It's a good thing I don't have a real job because cat crisis is probably going to be an unexcused reason for a break in the course of the day. But since you and I are just sitting here hanging out together, sorry, had to make a 2-minute catitude adjustment there. So, all right, we finished up talking about operational controls, and we covered a wide category from identity and access management and auditing and certification. We talked about a lot of things. So now it's time to move into the technical controls. I promise you, promise you, this is not a technical exam. We don't even go into technology much in the next few slides. And honestly, I probably go deeper than you would even see on the exam. Very high level stuff. But remember, this is not an exam for technicians. This is an exam for information security managers. So most of the time, your security managers are years away from being in the field. I can't tell you the last time I configured a rule on a firewall. It's been a while, right? But I know why I need a firewall, and I know where it needs to go, and I need, and I know generally what my options are. So that's how you want to approach the technology that I'm going to go through across the next, 15 or so slides. Don't go too in depth, and don't worry if you're not a technical person. If you are a technical person, back it up, back it up. Take it out of the weeds. You're thinking of generic solutions as opposed to nitpicky details. So if you're looking for an answer on a question that has you hacking the registry and modifying one of the keys, you're going about this way wrong, right? Look for broader solutions and understanding technology concepts. Okay? Don't go too deep. All right. Now, that being said, when we talk about technology controls, so these are those electronic controls that are implemented in order to protect our data. So we'll start off by talking about what are some of the threats to data and some of the ways we secure it. One of those ways is cryptography, and we'll talk very super high level, just mention cryptography for about 2.5 minutes. That's all you need. Endpoint security, so protecting individual systems like clients and servers, you know, individually as elements as opposed to network security, but protecting the systems themselves. But then we do get into network security. And what we want to understand with network security is that networking as a whole was typically designed to share information as opposed to secure it. So we have to add on security in various ways in order to keep it protected. Okay, so we'll look at some of the ways we do that. And then I've just added about 4 or 5 slides at the end just to give a quick nod to cloud integration. If you're an information security manager, you need to know a lot more about the cloud in real life, but for the exam, they are very upper level, just basically knowing the deployment models and the different types of services. Okay, so that's where we're headed in this next section. So, what's going on? How do we protect our data? What are the threats that exist? Well, this is a broad list. One of the words you notice I keep going back to is broad. Very clear, very good description of this exam. But anyway, broad discussion of some of the threats. And then underneath, what are some ways we can mitigate those threats? It's all about mitigating risks, right? So, with our data security, first of all, we're concerned about unauthorized access. We want to prevent unauthorized disclosure of data. We want to make sure only the people that have the need to know should access the data. So one of the things we do is make sure that for anybody to access data, they have to have strong authentication, multi-factor authentication, something I know, something I have, something I am, 2 of those. We encrypt data, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and encryption is a form of what we refer to as obfuscation. And obfuscation renders data unreadable. And certainly encryption does that. Now, there are other ways of obfuscation as well. We can use masking. Like if you type out your social security number on the screen, it's replaced with asterisks, for instance. That's masking out the significant data, and maybe all but the last 4 digits of your social show up. Anonymization simply says if you don't need it, don't store it. So, for instance, I want to find out, let's say I'm an insurance company and I'm coming into a certain area, a zip code, and I'm going to offer health insurance, but I don't know what to charge. So, one of the criteria to help me determine what to charge, I'm going to figure out how many smokers are in this specific zip code, 20910. And I decide the best way to do that is to purchase these lists from grocery stores for frequent shoppers. And I want to figure out how many people, as they're buying groceries, buy a carton of cigarettes. So when I purchase that list from a grocery store, I get a lot of other information. I get that person's name, phone number, address, um, maybe payment information. That's all personally identifiable information. But I don't need that. I just need to get a count of how many cartons of cigarettes were sold. So by anonymizing, meaning dumping the data I don't need, I reduce my liability because if I don't store it, I don't have to protect it. And if I don't store it, I don't have to protect against unauthorized usage or access. Now, liability, we think about using due care and due diligence. We've already talked about that. We don't get into technical attacks in this course, but certainly most folks have heard of denial of service attacks and other issues with availability. So the way we solve those is redundancy of data. And we may disperse data across multiple locations in case one location's unavailable, we have it in other locations. For corruption, I'm going to talk about hashes in just a minute. Another important system from a technical controls perspective is data leakage. Data loss prevention systems, really important to an organization if they want to control what information is being exfiltrated off the network. So when we talk about data exfiltration, is sensitive data being printed? Is it being copied? Is it being emailed? Is it being uploaded? Those are all ways that data gets exfiltrated. And of course, data exfiltration can lead to data compromise. So a DLP system analyzes the data, usually based on labels or format, and determines and can either audit or block certain types of data from being exfiltrated, like credit card numbers, social security numbers, and that sort of thing. Okay. Those are the big ones I want to focus on here. Excuse me. All right. Cryptography, or if you're not from North Carolina, some people call it cryptography. And with cryptography, this is a way we can really protect our data. And we can also get some assurance that the data is initiating from where it's supposed to be coming from, that we are going to be able to verify the origin of a message. We get a lot more from cryptography than just privacy. But we definitely get privacy, right? We're going to protect unauthorized disclosure of information. And if we go back to our classification scheme that we looked at a little bit ago, one of the things about classification is that it provides us guidance to protect data across all of its states. Now, data can be at rest, meaning you've saved it to a hard drive. It can be in process, meaning transactions are being manipulated live time or you're working with the data. And then data can be in motion, meaning it's being uh, transported across the network, uploaded or downloaded. So a classification scheme is going to mandate that data is protected universally regardless of its state. So when we think about protecting data, one of the first things we think about is encrypting it, right? Obfuscating the data using keys, generally speaking. So I can encrypt data on hardware storage devices, which means I store it to the hardware and that device itself encrypts the data. Or I can use software like an operating system. Windows has encrypted file system. I can right click and check encrypt file. But it's important that when data is in storage, if I care about its privacy, I encrypt it. Now, data in motion, it's out on the network moving from point A to point B. When we talk about data traversing a network, the protocol responsible for that is IP, Internet Protocol. But just like so many things, IP was not designed to be secure, it was designed to function. You know, things can function securely, but it was designed just with functionality in mind. So, IP, not secure. So, when data is traversing the network using IP, I have to add additional protocols in order to secure it. Now, we don't go into IPsec here or SSL/TLS or Secure Shell. I've got just a couple of protocols underneath Data in Motion or underneath Motion, and these are protocols or frameworks that would add security. They're really frameworks, but we're not gonna split those hairs. Um, so we have to add on security. Remember, that's the difference between incorporating security and spraying security on top. We would rather use a secure protocol. IP is not a secure protocol. IP6, IP version 6, is designed inherently secure with security provided by IPsec. How many of you have heard we're going to IP6? How many of you have heard we're going to IPv6 for the last 10 years? IP6 is really kind of an idea that as far as local networks has kind of uh, missed its opportunity, so to speak. Cloud service providers still manage and oversee IPv6 networks, but we just don't see them on the local level. But we're still using IPv4. If we did use IPv6, security would be built in. We'd have a better chance of security. There's some other issues with IP6 that kind of that are really kind of the reasons we didn't implement it wide scale. All right, so that's privacy. How do you get privacy? You encrypt. You can use hardware encryption, you can use software encryption through security frameworks or protocols. The next element of security that we get from cryptography is called authenticity. And that means I'm going to prove a claim. I claim to be Kelly Handerhan. Anybody can claim to be anybody else. So what authenticity adds is proof of that claim. And I prove I am who I say I am, sometimes by things I know like passwords, but often with technology, we use keys and digital certificates. Okay. So when I connect to Bank of America's web server, Bank of America's web server sends back a digital certificate that says this is guaranteed to be Bank of America. Now, are they foolproof? No, but they provide one factor of authentication. So that's one way. The fact that I use Kelly Handerhan's private key guarantees I'm Kelly Handerhan because only Kelly Handerhan should have Kelly Handerhan's private key, right? So nothing's foolproof. It's just one part of a multi-factor authentication scheme. For integrity, with integrity, the idea is I want to be able to detect unauthorized changes, modifications. Okay. Now, in order to do that, we use hashes. And hashes essentially are digital representations of data. So basically, it's almost like I create a message and I take a snapshot of it and I send you the message in the snapshot. When you get the message, take a snapshot of it. You compare the two snapshots, and if the two snapshots are the same, you say, oh, message hasn't been modified. So a hash is just a digital thumbprint that's added before a message is sent. On the receiving end, a digital thumbprint is created, and if the two thumbprints match, we get the assurance there's been no modification. So you may hear the term a hash or a message digest. Sometimes you hear the term checksum. For our purposes, they'll all mean the same thing. It's a way of verifying integrity. Now, non-repudiation means I can't dispute having sent a message nor the contents of the message. Can't dispute having sent a message nor the contents of a message. So I can't say, oh, that message didn't come from me. Somebody spoofed it. And I also can't say, okay, that message came from me, but somebody must have modified it in transit. Okay. That's non-repudiation. And we use digital signatures, which basically is going to be the use of my private key and a hash together in order to create a digital signature. So that gives me non-repudiation. All right. Very upper level. You may not even see the word cryptography on the exam. Okay? If so, they tend to ask about non repudiation. How do you get non repudiation? A digital signature. Protecting your endpoints. How in this world do you protect your endpoints? You do the stuff that's part of due care. You patch your systems. You remove unnecessary services. You change default configurations. You rename guest and administrative accounts. You create and enforce the baseline image. You have good change and configuration management in place, right? Those things that we've talked about doing. And you do that regardless of the system being a desktop or a laptop or a server or this or that. We should have baseline security configurations to protect our endpoints on the network. Now, another big important idea in the world of security is the use of firewalls and how we protect our network from um, external threat. Usually it's from external threat when we're using firewalls. And what I have here on the screen is a drawing of a very conceptual drawing of a segmented network. Okay. Looks like I could adjust the font a little bit here. I'll work on that. Um, the idea is that over on the right, we have the internet, which is a bad neighborhood, right? You don't want to be caught alone on the internet. Bad neighborhood. Now, over on the left, we have our LAN. This is our trusted network, and by that meaning, these are our resources that we want to protect. This is where my domain is. This is where my data is. This is where my systems and processes and everything are. So there's no way I'd ever let resources from the internet directly access my LAN. And then also in the middle, often we have another network called the DMZ, Demilitarized Zone. And that DMZ represents certain servers that I would want available to the general public, but they're under my control and supervision. So by that, I mean they're not totally under my protection because I'm letting the general public in, but they are more protected than the internet. So sometimes we refer to that as a semi-trusted network. Now, a lot of people will say often you think of the environment as zero trust. Nobody from outside the land is trusted, and that's fine. But this term trusted is beyond that. Um, this term trusted is going to indicate my control over the environment. Kind of think of it that way. All right, now if I want to isolate these areas of trust, I have to also acknowledge, though, that traffic may need to move between the various layers of trust. So, how can I allow untrusted entities to access my trusted web server or my semi trusted web server, or even allow people from home to use the internet to access my LAN? Well, I've got to have protection as traffic moves from one network to the other. And that's really what a firewall does. A firewall uses rules that have been created often by administrators to determine what traffic is allowed to pass from one zone of trust to another. So as traffic from the internet, as users try to access my screen subnet, that traffic goes through a firewall and examines the traffic for certain criteria. And my firewall might block traffic according to an IP address or port number or whatever that may be. But if the traffic meets the criteria that's allowed, the traffic is allowed into the DMZ. So firewalls are one of the main ways that we segment our networks. They provide traffic inspection based on different criteria, and there are different types of firewalls. This over here is really more for your information than it is something for the CISM exam. But different types of firewalls use different types of criteria to block or allow traffic. But ultimately, we separate zones of trust and traffic moving from a more trusted or less trusted to a more trusted environment needs to go through inspection through a firewall. Or even if there are different segments, even if they're at the same level of trust, we still want to control the flow of traffic from segment to segment. And firewalls are tools that do that. All right, let's see what we have here next. Okay, this is a whole lot on wireless. This is infinitely more testable than you need. This is actually from my CISSP course, but let me give you the idea here. When we're talking about protecting our wireless communications, when we say protecting, there are two main areas of protection we care about. We want our traffic encrypted, and we want to make sure nobody can get on our network that shouldn't be on our network, right? So, to protect the privacy of our network, we encrypt. And we've got choices on the crypto systems that we can use. So, if you set up a wireless access point, it's going to either be using WEP, WPA, WPA2, or WPA3. WEP and WPA should be dead to us. They should be out of our range of consideration. But systems hold on to, or organizations hold on to old technology with the thought of, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There are still WEP environments out there and WPA environments. Those were designed for a different time, a different era. They have no place in today's world. I hate to say it that in concrete. So they have little place in today's world. WPA2 came along and fixed the problems with WEP and WPA for the most part. Um, and then WPA3 has added a little bit over WPA2. We don't really talk in terms of, hey, none of these have been broken, but the idea of have they been broken with a high enough work factor? Meaning, did it take a large amount of time, processing capability, skills? Because there are already cracks for WPA3 out there. Does that impact the majority of the population? Not at all. Okay. So, what should you be using, WPA2 or 3, to protect? You shouldn't be considering WEP or WPA. Now, for authentication, authentication on a large network can be a real challenge. So, I want to provide a way to have greater control on who gets access to the network. I want it to be as easy for an administrator to configure as possible. And that's where a service called Radius comes in. When you're determining policy or security or anything along those lines, you can manage things centrally or you can manage them decentrally, if that's even a word. You can manage them in a decentralized environment. Okay. If you're wondering, yes, we're almost going to take a break, but let me just finish this one piece real quick. Hang in there, take a deep breath, a sip of coffee. I know a lot of this technical stuff is tough to get through. We're getting there. So, if I manage things from a central location, let's say security, well, I push all security out from the main office. It's easy. I don't have to go to each branch office. I configure policy, I push it out. There's only one place to configure policy. Everybody gets a universal policy. I only have to secure one policy server. Boom. Centralization has a lot of benefits. Ease of use, lower cost, greater control, greater security. But the problem may be, what if every branch office needs a different type of security? Well, then centralized isn't best. A phrase to associate with decentralized environments is that it's closer aligned with business goals and objectives. So the office in Dallas can configure their policy based on what their goals are. And the office in New York can have totally different policy. And the office in LA can do their own thing. Radius is a centralized server. So what I'm saying is I could go in and configure policy on every access point and every VPN and every remote access server. And what that would allow me to do is have really close alignment with business objectives. I might have an access point in the sales center that has rules just for salespeople. An access point two might be in production with rules according to the production environment. But if I want a consistent set of rules for remotely accessing the network, what I do is I take all those devices and I configure them to forward their request to Radius. And where do I configure policy? On the Radius server. Which server has to be protected? The Radius server. Which server has to be secured in terms of policy? The Radius server. So centralized remote access uses a Radius server. But just centralization and management as a whole makes life easier for an administrator. Right? It's just easier to manage. It's more secure because you only have to work from one server. It's consistent. Decentralized gives you more flexibility. Okay, so um, here's what's up. Let's take just a measly little 5-minute break. Grab a drink, not that kind of drink. Grab a soda and or a cup of coffee. Run to the restroom super fast. Meet me back here in 5 minutes at 2:25. Can we do it? We do not have much left to go at all, okay? But I do wanna take just a quick break because I need to run to the restroom and make sure the cat hasn't fallen somewhere. Um, 5 minutes, let's be back at 2:25, and we'll be on the last leg of the tour. Thank you, guys. See you in just a few minutes. All right, welcome back from a short break there. If any of you've ever tried to give a cat a pill, there is no such thing as a quick way to do that. So hopefully I coaxed her into taking that. We'll find out. Anyway, so we are back. We've been talking about some technical controls. And again, can't stress enough, don't go too tech, don't get too nerdy for this exam. Stay out of the weeds. Good management based decisions that are balanced across management, operational, and technology controls. So don't lean too heavy on tech. It's just one area of control that we're looking at, and we want to make sure that we have that balance, that nice balanced approach. So we were wrapping up talking about technical controls, and we had talked a little bit about firewalls and wireless security. I just want to mention a handful of services because this is one of the benefits we get with the network is we have often automated services that facilitate communication and addressing and so on. A couple of the main services, the services I think could show up on the exam. The big one I think that's going to show up is the two big ones. I think you may hear some references to DNS and to DHCP. Now, nowhere near how you would configure one, but I would know what they do and then how they may be exploited. So, the easy answer for what does DNS do is name resolution. I have no idea what the IP address for Amazon is. I don't think in terms of numbers, but I know to go to Amazon.com and do my shopping. So DNS, anytime I put in a request that's name based, that request is directed to a DNS server, and essentially it works out like, hey, what's the IP address for Amazon? So the DNS server provides that name resolution. And I talked about the other day the attack on the DNS company or the company that provided DNS for like Amazon and Twitter and so on, being Dyn, and how an attack on the DNS server for those organizations took down, essentially brought traffic to a screeching halt. So DNS is really a critical network service. It's such an important service that if I target a specific DNS server, I am likely to impact numerous systems across the internet. So attacks on DNS might be called farming, which is a common attack on a DNS server that basically involves modification of DNS records. So it's the record that says there are different types of records, but there's a host record out on the internet for Amazon.com. And if someone goes in and changes the IP address of real Amazon's web servers to a rogue site, that'd be called farming. Now, there's also what's called cache poisoning, and cache is where we store information that we've already learned. And so if I already learned the IP address of Amazon and someone modifies that cache, then I'm still going to be redirected. So the problem that we have with DNS is that it's so important. Modification of it could, have far-reaching effects. The other problem is, like so many things that we've talked about, there's no built-in security. So DNS is not secure by default. Now, there are a set of security extensions called DNSSEC that can be added to DNS servers so that they authenticate with one another and they kind of mitigate the risk of having rogue information added. But again, that's just a step of add-on security as opposed to building a secure service. So when you think about name resolution, you definitely should be thinking about DNS. And one of the big threats to DNS is farming and also poisoning. All right. Now, DHCP. DHCP is a service that allows us to assign IP addresses to individual systems automatically. As a network admin, having to walk to every single system on the network and configure an IP address, it's very cumbersome. right? That's not something I want to do as, day to day. And then, as new systems come on the network, configuring and as systems leave the network, keeping up with all that. So DHCP handles address assignment automatically. Now, when a system comes onto the network, it uses a discover broadcast. So that's a broadcast that essentially says, hey, is anybody out there a DHCP server? Now, every DHCP server that hears that request offers an IP address. Hey, I'm a DHCP server, take my address. The client responds to the first server that offered and requests that IP address. So that client doesn't check for a list of verified servers. It just hears a server say, here's an IP address, and it takes it in the request. And then and then that DHCP server acknowledges the request and removes the IP address from its scope. But what I'm getting at there is the fault within this process, and this process is sometimes called DORA, discover, offer, request, acknowledge. So the problem within this DORA process is there's no authentication for the DHCP server that offers the address. And that client takes whatever IP address is offered and doesn't provide any sort of authentication. So that's a concern because someone could have a rogue DHCP server on the network and wind up providing my clients with bogus IP addresses. And there are other security issues, maybe even of greater concern, like giving them false information about who the the DNS server would be, and so it could be a really big problem. All right. So the DORA process for DHCP is not secure at all. Again, built to work, not to work secure. Okay. I'll also just mention a couple of other services. LDAP. LDAP stands for Lightweight Directory Access Services. This is what your domain controllers are running. If you have Active Directory in Windows environments, they're likely running LDAP. And LDAP is a scaled down version of a larger directory protocol called X.500. Can't see that coming up on the test, but that's why it's called lightweight, is X500, very cumbersome, had a lot more functionality than was needed for just an internal network environment. So LDAP, associate that with domain controllers. So an intruder is doing a network scan. Which of the following would be most desirable for an attacker? Okay. End user workstation, mail server, web server, LDAP server. Your LDAP server has all user information, including hashes of their passwords. Um, it would be the first step in compromising the passwords for a network. For denial of service attack, you wouldn't be able to have network access. So LDAP's a really critical service running on your network. And of course, you have mail services, you have web services, and they each have their own vulnerabilities. Any network service, anything that you put on the network, just by default is going to be vulnerable to a degree because network implies that there's access to it, right? So with web services, you might hear things like cross-site scripting, you might hear denial of service, you might hear code injection. There are all sorts of issues. Mail services, if you denial of service a mail server, we don't get email. Or if I target, your email, I might gain access to confidential information. So I think kind of understanding the gist of what the services do and a high level of what attacks might exist and what the impact of that would be, I think that's more than sufficient. All right. And then the intrusion detection or protecting the network by having detective mechanisms on the network. So intrusion detection systems are one. And intrusion detection systems monitor network traffic looking for malicious activity. You could also have honeypots or honey nets on the network. A honeypot is a decoy. That often comes up. A honeypot is a decoy system. So if an attacker is in my DMZ, looking at the systems in my DMZ, and they come across a system that appears to be unpatched. It looks like it has folders called customer data, financial information, whatever. That's going to look really appealing to an attacker. So I have this system that looks vulnerable. And if attackers looking to target a system, they see this, they're like, oh, that's where I want to direct my activity. So it's a way of distracting an attacker from my real true resources. And then if I have a collection of these honeypots, I have a honey net, a network of honeypots. Mhm. So we evaluate, it's one of the ways we monitor our network. We also don't forget to look at our logs. Sometimes we think about looking at the logs after the damage is done. Don't forget your logs. And then we've already talked about audit access to resources. And we mentioned SIM systems, system information and event viewers that pull information across the network so that I can view the information um, at a single location centrally. All right, I don't think you'll see NAC in the exam. Cloud. Couple of short notes on cloud computing. Mhm. So if we look at cloud computing, we know that that's, kind of uh, been the term for the last 10 years. Everybody's concerned with moving to the cloud, working in the cloud. What do we need to bring back from the cloud? What needs to be migrated to the cloud? That's obviously been a very hot topic, and well so. What really enabled cloud computing was virtualization. That's what made it profitable for an Amazon or Microsoft or Google to offer cloud-based resources to customers. Is that, instead of having to have a dedicated system for each customer, I now can have, a massively well-equipped, very powerful system, and I can split the resources up to, you know, 10 different companies and give them virtual space and virtual computing on a single server. So it becomes profitable at that point. So once cloud service providers figured out that this was, hey, this was good business, then organizations started to see the benefits of moving to the cloud. Being able to access your data from anywhere you are is a tremendous benefit. Having somewhere to store data that you can access it, like I said, from anywhere, but also to have confidence that that data is protected and is secure. Um, when we talk about moving resources to the cloud, like our infrastructure, I don't have to pay for servers up front. I don't have to go out and pay for, you know, 55 different servers. I can use that computing power of a cloud service provider. So there are all sorts of reasons that the cloud has become, that we've been talking about the cloud and migrating to the cloud. What it comes down to is when someone moves to the cloud, almost always it's about money. It's going to save me money up front. Even if maybe in the long run, I may wind up spending a little bit less, maybe that trade off is worth it. It's going to make me more efficient. It's going to allow me to increase productivity or availability. What it comes down to is we determine that the benefits of the cloud outweigh the cost. So when we talk about, this idea of the cloud, a couple of decisions we have to make, and we have to determine what are the security risks. Now, just the very nature of accessing resources across the internet has some, inherent security concerns. We've already said the internet's a bad neighborhood. So I have to think about, do I have protected access? Is my data encrypted? Do I have the physical communications equipment to do so? Um, what what sort of do I have a strategy in place for what gets migrated to the cloud and what doesn't? So there's some upfront, just generic risks, regardless of what type of cloud service you're accessing. If you're accessing a public cloud, in a public cloud environment simply means that you have multiple vendors that are lease spaced on a virtual on a system, and they're given virtual space and virtual networks, virtual machines, virtual everything. But multiple parties or organizations are sharing the same physical device. Well, anytime I'm sharing the same physical device with other organizations, that's a risk, right? I don't know what's going on with those other organizations. I don't know if something that they do in their virtualized environment might wind up impacting me. I don't know what would happen if the server had to physically be seized because of criminal activity for one of the other tenants. Now, of course, all this should be spelled out in my service level agreement, but those are concerns, right? So there are multiple security risks, particularly for a public cloud-based environment, because you have multiple entities using the physical hardware. I also have to remember that just because I'm using a cloud service provider for things like data storage, it doesn't mean that I'm not liable for the protection of those assets. Now, I can share the risk with my cloud service provider through a service level agreement. But what that essentially does is it says, if there's a compromise, then you'll be financially compensated. But I'm still liable. So, for instance, if I'm a healthcare provider and I have patient data and I have to be compliant, I have to store it in a certain way according to HIPAA. Store it on a cloud service provider, and that cloud service provider doesn't protect it according to HIPAA. I'm liable for that data. Now, they may owe me money and I may have to pursue that in other ways, but I'm still liable because ultimately, even though we're storing our data in the cloud, we're still liable. We're still the data owners. We have the ultimate accountability. It's just like the idea that just because I outsource doesn't get me off the hook, right? I can't just send it to someone else to deal with. Um, Talked about the public cloud environment where multiple tenants share the same system. There are also private clouds where if you have a higher security need and legal or regulatory requirements don't allow you to share hardware with other tenants, you may have a private cloud, which means you have exclusive use to the hardware. That might be managed within your organization, or you may outsource the management. But what makes it a private cloud is that no other entities share that space. And then the hybrid is you may use resources in the private cloud, but in specific times of increased traffic or need, you might use public resources. And then community clouds are for specific industries or specific types of business. Like I just mentioned HIPAA a minute ago. Well, healthcare providers' data has to be protected through HIPAA. Now, it's expensive to have all your data in a private cloud because you have to essentially deal with exclusive ownership, and that's obviously more expensive. So, what we may have is an environment where maybe a vendor is focusing on the medical community and they have multiple tenants, but all of the same security needs, and their configurations are designed to meet the needs of medical providers, for instance. So, that would be a community cloud. Day's been a full day, hasn't it? Yes, yes, it is. All right, last little thing. When we talk about cloud services, there are really three main categories. There's software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. Okay, those are the main categories, but quite honestly, everything today is as a service, right? Like if there's an internet element to it, it's as a service. Like I said, I'm marketing Kelly as a service right now. But you hear security as a service, forensics as a service, incident response, business continuity as a service, disaster recovery, blah, 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 blah. So there are all sorts of sort of niches. There are all sorts of little specialties within these categories. When it comes down to it, software, platform, infrastructure. So software is the most common. It's ubiquitous. The days of going to the store and buying a CD or a DVD of software and installing it locally on your computer, those days are gone. Most software that we access today is done through a website, and I go to QuickBooks.com instead of having QuickBooks installed locally. We've been using software as a service with email for decades, right? We don't install an email app on our system. We use Yahoo or Gmail or whatever the various sources are that are out there. So, software as a service is very common. We have to remember again, we are still accountable for our data, the data that we own. So, if we are transmitting this data in an unprotected way, if we are allowing data to be stored somewhere unprotected, if we're not controlling user access to and from these services, we're at fault. We're liable. We're accountable. So those are just some concerns with software as a service. Now, platform as a service, just the quick deal for the CISM exam is if they talk about software developers, it's platform as a service. Okay. And actually, for most exams, they just shortcut. But the reality of it is, it's for more than just software developers. But the idea is if I'm going to create an application, I'm not going to write 50,000 lines of code, right? I'm going to use code from code libraries. I'm going to need an environment in which to run and test my software. I'm going to need a database for users that enter information to my software that needs to go to a backend database. I'm going to need various tools. So when we talk about platform as a service, it's much bigger than just, hey, I need somewhere where I can go write my code, right? Because I'm really taking this software and I'm making it available to the masses, and that's what I get through platform as a service. And then when you hear people talking about moving to the cloud or migrating to the cloud, a lot of times they're usually talking about infrastructure as a service, where all those things that we used to do locally in our data center or even on a smaller scale in our server rooms. That's now being accessed through the internet. And we're using virtual machines from our cloud service provider, virtual switches, virtual firewalls. Everything's become virtual today, right? So we're accessing these resources. And the thing to remember is we're in many ways mirroring our old physical infrastructure, but it's being done now logically and it's being managed by software as opposed through hardware. And it gives us a million benefits. It saves us the cost of hardware. It saves us the costs associated with hardware, like management and upkeep, heating and cooling. So there are lots of benefits. Now, again, it's not free and it's not cheap, but when it comes to really evaluating all the costs associated with running our own infrastructure, most organizations find that they do save money and they certainly save on capital expenses with infrastructure as a service. Okay. So, boom, check it out. It's been a long day. We've talked about a lot of stuff, right? But here's what we've covered. We've talked about an information security program and what its purpose is. It provides the means to accomplish our security strategy. And of course, we want that program to be in alignment with business objectives. We talked about policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines, and how they're administrative controls that set the groundwork for our our operational and technical controls. And they're part of a balanced approach to security. We spent a good amount of a good amount of time going through the operational controls, and those controls being controls that are implemented by people. And I know that's kind of Kind of an idea is, well, what isn't implemented by people? Well, people rather than machines. So people audit, although machines can audit too. It depends on the contact, but people patch systems, people analyze vulnerability, people develop processes for identity and access management. Those are all operational controls, and they're part of the day-to-day elements of security. And then we spend a lot of times talking about technical controls because there are so many technical controls that are out there. I would settle for a very basic understanding of why I would use a firewall, where I would put a firewall, what would go in the DMZ. Your DMZ is going to be your web server and your mail server. It's also going to be, in there is where you put your honeypots, for instance, right? So I would look at from a very broad level your tech. I don't want you to see, oh, she talked about Wi-Fi protected access, WPA3, for instance. Oh, let me go out and read a white paper on WPA3. Not at all. And the slides that I'm working on, that I'm working off of, that I'm sharing with you, these are the same slides I teach a CISM class off of. So I don't want you to feel like because it's a live stream that you're getting kind of the short end of the stick here. This is exactly the material I teach my CISM courses. Now we move through it maybe a little bit quicker because we don't have that give and take that we normally would in a class, and we don't have, a lot of questions or comments in this. But I do want you to feel comfortable with the fact that the information I'm giving you across these days, we're at the end of day 3, we got one more day tomorrow, but I don't want you to feel confident and comfortable that this is the information that I share with the students I teach every day. You have to take this, you have to absorb it. You want to make sure that um, you want to make sure that you're studying. You want to make sure that you see exam preparation. Use exam prep software so that you can get questions in the context of how you would see them on the exam. Now, the other day I talked about Cybrary's Insider Pro, and I just want to once again kind of remind you that Cybrary's Insider Pro will give you, in addition to this course recorded so that you can look through it at your own pace, as well as other courses that you may want to study for in the future, like CISSP or CRISC or whatever's on your agenda. But you also get practice questions, and for the courses for which that's applicable, you get labs as well. And these labs are really great to give you some hands-on experience. Now, there are no labs associated with the CISM exam because it's a management course. It's more theory and concept. But if you were taking something like a CEH or CISSP, you'd have the lab support as well. So Cybrary Insider Pro, this is kind of this is a taste, a look at Cybrary and what we do here and what we try to offer our students. And the Insider Pro is just a step where um, you have additional support for studying and passing the test, is probably a good way to say it. Okay, so before we wrap it up for the day, I want to know, do you have any questions? We've covered a lot of information today, and we've kind of gone down the rabbit hole with tech a little bit. Hopefully, things made sense. There's been a lot more information today than yesterday, but I hope that it made sense. And as I always say when we're wrapping up class for the day, if we get done and you think of a question, you say, I wish I'd asked Kelly, write it down. Ask me first thing in the morning. I'll be happy to address it. All right. So we've covered what we set out to do today. If there are no other questions, we are going to wrap things up, and I'm going to wish every one of you a fantastic afternoon. And I hope to see you tomorrow, day 4. And day 4 is incident management, disaster recovery, business continuity. So lots of good stuff. Oh, I see we've got a question. So for those of you that are done, have a great afternoon. I'm going to stick around and see if anybody has any questions. No, zero trust is not a big deal on the exam. Um, and when we do talk about moving from one zone of trust to another, I'm kind of hesitant when I say that because we really do think about operating in a zero trust environment. I have my protected resources. Anything that's not within my local network is untrusted. And I don't care if it's just a little untrusted or mostly untrusted or all the way untrusted. The context of the word trusted when we talk about those environments, and this kind of goes back to earlier definitions of trust from like the days of the Orange Book and so on. What we're really talking about there is more control. What do I have control over versus what I don't have control over? And I know it's easy to kind of confuse that with, well, she just said the DMZ was semi trusted. We think of everything as untrusted. Agreed. But we're using the term slightly differently there. Um, and I totally understand the significance and importance of zero trust. I don't think that's something that would come up on the exam, though. Hope that answered your question. It's a really good one, really important one. Does anybody else have a question while we're here just hanging out together? All right, so if you didn't get to ask a question, write it down, and I will be here tomorrow, same time, same channel, and we're going to wrap up our last domain. So everybody, have a great afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow. Night, everybody.